All right, this is week 6, lecture 2, lecture 14 overall. So in the previous lecture, we did begin a discussion about change management, in particular, the sphere of cross-cultural engagement within the church. And I want to further extend that conversation by discussing a particular tool that has become extremely helpful in my ministry. Several years back, I had the privilege of working alongside of Brett and Tara Smith, a pastoral team that we invited on staff with us. Our decades-old traditional Nazarene church had made an intentional move to become more engaged in our community in navigating poverty and racial disparity, especially as it related to those coming from the penal system, addiction, and homelessness. Brett had worked for years in community development and mental health, and Tara had worked as the director of a pregnancy resource center in Kankakee. They both served as short-term missionaries in Papua New Guinea, and as you might imagine, they had extensive training because of all this in cross-cultural engagement. They were coming to a church that had good intentions, but whose methodology, led by yours truly, was still very much shaped by a system of power and privilege to those that were disadvantaged. It was a patronizing posture for sure, even though we didn't intend it as such. They intended to come in and help us understand our role within the context of compassion and relationships. As much as we were doing, our relationships were limited to philanthropy, which is not altogether helpful when it comes to cross-cultural engagement, as it turns out. Their first step was to put us into proximity with difference, with the other, in intentional and meaningful ways. And they called this exposure therapy. Only by engagement in real relationships with real people, with real stories, can our perceptions of the other begin to shift. However, in managing change, this mustn't be haphazard or forced, but in strategic and intentional. Step 1 was to change our relationship with the day shelter we were currently working with. Weekly, myself and a couple others would go down and serve breakfast, and then we'd leave. Brett helped us to understand the importance of inviting them to help cook, and some of us just out there hang out in the day room with them playing cards and chess and just being present. The goal was not what could we do for them, but to be with them as budding friendships. We couldn't begin to think or dream of the mission of God through impositional ministry by imposing our ideas of what they needed or how we could help them with no relational engagement or conversation at all. There were intentional times with intentional times of relational feedback. See, this is important exposure therapy. It's not simply about being in a shared space. It's also a process that creates a time for intentional debriefing and feedback regarding the experience. Cross-cultural ministry is difficult because it challenges perceptions, threatens values, questions worldviews, and to do so well requires space for those that are engaging in the process to do so well requires a space for those that are engaging to process through what we're encountering and experiencing, letting them give voice to what they feel is even weird or strange. This process was emphasized over and over again. In 2008, we took a trip led by Brett to the Sanctuary in downtown Toronto. This ministry is a drop-in for the homeless, for meals and art programs, and also as a church. When they host missions teams, they do so in a different kind of way. Missions teams from the U.S. are often work-related, right? What do we do to help those in need? When one goes to the Sanctuary, you come as a guest and as a learner. Upon arriving, we headed to the kitchen to cook dinner for the drop-in friends that evening. However, we were informed by the head chef, who was also a homeless guy, that we had to be at the Sanctuary no less than 6 months before we could cook. Since we weren't going to be there more than 6 days, that was problematic. What do? We asked. You go out and you eat with those that come in. You sit, you talk, and you share life with them. That's what we need. That we need relationships. So we did. Throughout the evening, we heard stories, laughed together, we cried together. All meals are shared family style to ensure that everyone eats with dignity and can serve themselves however much they want. After that time, we would then debrief. It was interesting. One night in particular, We had gone, this was in, I think it was in January. We'd gone on a tour of the city, which you can imagine is pretty cold, it's snowy in Toronto. We'd gone for a tour in the city, and we were walking, we were walking for hours, literally freezing. And we were getting a bit frustrated, and we didn't get back to the church until about 12:30. One of the hosts had led us around. He was very involved in the city, knew exactly where to take us. And I was about to have a conversation with him regarding the what I would say the irresponsibility of leading a bunch of folks from Tennessee through the snow-beaten streets of Toronto. And he said, okay, we're about to go back out. And I said, oh no, we're not going to go back out. And he said to us, must be nice, right, to be able to say, no, we're not going to go back out. He said, the people that you just talked to tonight at the drop-in, they don't have that privilege. They don't get to say, no, we're not going to go back out. They may go into a cafe or a restaurant for a few moments, but then get driven out. And he said, then they're back out there on the streets. And what that exposure to that world of difference meant for us is we had to reflect upon the way in which we understood homelessness and the struggles and the processes through which people walked through homelessness within the city. And one of the ways we as Nazarenes, I think, can do this is we can turn our work and witness trips into global learning trips. Just the change of language, I think, will be helpful. Work and witness trips have with them the air that we know what we're doing and we're going to go as the blessing. But given that much of Christianity is absolutely exploding in cultural context different than from America, it might be that we have a lot to learn instead. What if we landed with the idea that we're going to be recipients of what we can receive from them? In summer 2017, I had the privilege of leading a team of college-age adults to Nairobi, Kenya, for a learning trip. Now, we did work. We worked at an orphanage, but most of what we did was listen and learn. We built relationships and were shown around. And I watched the worldview of these students begin to expand as we became resident students of those who were doing ministry extremely, extremely well in that city. We would then come back in the evenings and we would debrief everything we experienced and saw. There were moments of confession, moments of fear and frustration. For some it was overwhelming, and for others they felt like they could make that city a home. Exposure therapy means intentionally taking groups of people from your community of faith into some relational settings with the other to be with, share life, converse, and even work alongside. It then steps back and it reflects. It guides those that are participating into an honest assessment of what they're encountering and experiencing. A friend of mine has done this with his church. A friend of mine has done this with his church and the mosque that backs up against his property. Instead of harboring ill will based on misconception, they began a process of doing life together by sharing meals from time to time in each other's settings, teaching each other how to cook various dishes, which was, I thought, amazing. He would then take that group and reflect on what they had experienced. What did they hear, learn, what startled them, confused them, or frustrated them? This simple act of regularly cooking together began to reshape the ethos of the congregation. And in a city with a substantial Muslim population, this act of goodwill and friendship based on exposure to the other and the therapy of friendship that is transformative turned potential enemies in a politically divisive time into friends. So where can you take others into situations where they can be exposed intentionally to the others that you're trying to reach? Questions to ask as you debrief may sound something like this. What were your first impressions of those you met? In what ways do you imagine your assumptions affected your first impressions? What was one thing you learned from a conversation that began to shift your perception? What did you get the sense were the values of the people you shared life with? How did those values either agree or disagree with yours? Was there any time you felt foolish and why? And I think that's a really important question. What frustrated you most about your engagement? If you could ask them, why do you do that? What question would you ask? And how might your posture change the next time you step into that space with them now that you've had a meaningful engagement with them? Those are just some of the questions you might ask upon reflection, which I think is also a very important thing to do as you're helping people navigate cross-cultural contexts. So that is week 6, lecture 2. We will have one more lecture for week 6, and that is going to be talking about how do we form relationships with people of peace and what exactly does that mean.